The man alone fought the duel of honor without fear. The next day, the chief offered him his native daughter. The bullet grazed past his ear so close he felt the heat sear his skin. But Thomas Garrett did not flinch. He stood there in the center of that dusty clearing, boots planted firm in the Arizona dirt, staring down a man twice his size while an entire Navajo village watched in absolute silence. What happened in the next 3 minutes would determine whether he lived to see another sunrise or whether his body would feed the vultures circling overhead. But that was not what occupied his mind. What consumed every fiber of his being was the promise he had made to himself the day his brother died. A promise carved so deep into his soul that fear had no room to breathe. 3 days earlier, Thomas had ridden into the town of Redemption Ridge with nothing but a worn saddle, a rifle that had seen better years, and a reputation that preceded him like a shadow. At 38 years old, his face carried the map of a hard life. Lines etched around his eyes told stories of too many sunrises spent tracking outlaws across unforgiving terrain. His hands, calloused and scarred, had built homesteads and buried friends. The silver beginning to thread through his dark hair was not from age, but from the weight of decisions that left marks deeper than any blade. Redemption Ridge sat on the edge of Navajo territory, a ramshackle collection of wooden buildings that served as the last outpost before the vast expanse of tribal land stretched toward the mountains. The town existed in a delicate balance, a place where white settlers and native people traded goods and maintained an uneasy peace. That peace was about to shatter. Thomas dismounted outside the saloon as the afternoon sun hammered down on the weathered planks. The street was quieter than it should have been for a Thursday. Windows had shutters drawn. No children played in the dust. Something was wrong. He could feel it the way a man feels a storm coming hours before the first clouds appear. Inside the saloon, the bartender, a thick-necked man named Sullivan, was wiping down glasses with hands that shook slightly. 3 men sat at a corner table, their conversation dying the moment Thomas stepped through the door. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he approached the bar. Thomas laid a silver coin on the counter without speaking. Sullivan poured whiskey into a glass that had seen cleaner days and slid it across. His eyes darted toward the corner table, then back to Thomas. The whiskey burned going down, but it was honest burn, not the rot gut some establishment served. Thomas set the glass down and waited. In places like this, information came to those patient enough to let the silence do the asking. Sullivan leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. The words came out fast, tumbling over each other like rocks down a hillside. A Navajo chief's son had been killed 2 nights ago, shot in the back while returning from a trading run. The killer was a drifter named Calhoun, a man with a taste for violence and whiskey in equal measure. Calhoun had been bragging about it in this very saloon, claiming the young man had cheated him in a trade. The tribal council was demanding justice. The town marshal, a coward named Peters, had locked himself in his office and refused to intervene. War parties were gathering in the hills. If someone did not bring Calhoun to justice within 3 days, the Navajo would come down and burn Redemption Ridge to ash. Thomas finished his whiskey and set the glass down with a hollow sound that echoed in the quiet room. This was not his fight. He had come to this territory to find work, perhaps guide a wagon train or track some cattle rustlers. Getting involved in tribal disputes was a quick way to end up dead. But as he turned to leave, he saw something through the window that stopped him cold. A young woman was crossing the street, carrying a basket of supplies. She moved with purpose, her long black hair catching the sunlight like polished obsidian. She wore a dress that blended traditional Navajo patterns with practical frontier clothing, a testament to the delicate cultural dance this town performed daily. But it was not her appearance that held his attention. It was the way every man on the street watched her pass with a mixture of respect and fear. She walked as though she owned the very ground beneath her feet, her chin raised, eyes forward, acknowledging no one. Sullivan noticed where Thomas was looking, and his voice dropped even lower. That was Aida, daughter of Chief Tahoma. She had come to town to purchase medicine for her people. She was 20 years old and already considered one of the most influential voices in her tribe. Her father trusted her counsel above his own war chiefs. She spoke 4 languages fluently and had negotiated trade agreements that kept food on tables through harsh winters. But she was also known for her fierce pride and unwillingness to accept disrespect of any kind. Thomas watched her disappear into the general store. Something about the way she carried herself reminded him of his younger brother, Daniel. That same unshakable confidence, that same refusal to bend. Daniel had possessed a moral clarity that Thomas had always envied. Where Thomas saw shades of gray, Daniel saw only right and wrong. It had gotten him killed 6 months ago when he stood up to a corrupt land baron who was forcing settlers off their claims. Thomas had arrived 2 days too late to help. He had buried his brother under a cottonwood tree and made a promise to the empty sky. Never again would he turn away from injustice simply because it was not his fight. He turned back to Sullivan and asked where he could find Calhoun. The bartender's eyes widened. He shook his head rapidly, insisting Thomas did not want any part of this. Calhoun rode with 4 other men, all of them killers. They had holed up in an abandoned ranch house 5 miles north of town. The marshal had refused to go after them, claiming it was outside his jurisdiction. The Navajo could not act without starting a war that would bring the cavalry down on their people. Everyone was trapped in a stalemate while the clock ticked down. Thomas asked for another whiskey. As Sullivan poured, Thomas studied the amber liquid catching the light. His brother's voice echoed in his memory, words spoken around a campfire years ago. Daniel had said that a man's character was not measured by what he did when people were watching, but by what he chose to do when he could walk away with no consequences. Thomas had thought about those words every day since the funeral. He drank the second whiskey faster than the first. Then he walked out of the saloon into the harsh afternoon light. His horse, a sturdy roan Mari named Cassie, waited patiently at the hitching post. He checked his rifle, confirmed his ammunition, and swung into the saddle. Several townspeople had gathered on the boardwalk, watching him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to pity. They knew where he was headed. They also knew he would not be coming back. The ride north took him through terrain that grew increasingly desolate. Sagebrush and scattered juniper trees dotted the landscape. In the distance, red rock formations rose like the bones of some ancient creature breaking through the earth's skin. The sun was merciless, turning the air into something thick and oppressive. Sweat soaked through his shirt, but Thomas barely noticed. His mind was occupied with tactics, angles, possibilities. 4 men plus Calhoun. Poor odds for a frontal assault. But Thomas had not survived 15 years as a tracker by being reckless. He would need to approach carefully, study their patterns, wait for the right moment. Patience was a weapon most men forgot to load. The abandoned ranch house came into view as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. It sat in a shallow depression, surrounded by dead grass and the remnants of a corral that had long since rotted away. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating the men were inside. Thomas dismounted a quarter mile out and led Cassie into a small ravine where she would be hidden from view. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard and began the slow, careful approach on foot. From a rise overlooking the property, Thomas settled into a position behind a cluster of rocks and watched. Through the cracked windows he could see movement. Shadows passed back and forth. Occasionally, rough laughter drifted across the distance. These were men confident in their safety, believing themselves beyond the reach of consequences. As darkness fell, Thomas counted the men as they moved past the windows. 5, just as Sullivan had said. They were drinking heavily, their movements becoming increasingly erratic. A plan began to form in Thomas's mind. It was risky, perhaps even foolish, but it was the only option he could see that did not end with him full of bullets. He waited until the moon rose, a pale sliver that provided just enough light to navigate by, but not enough to expose him. Then he moved down the slope like a ghost, each step placed with careful precision. The night air had turned cold, his breath visible in small clouds. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out, its voice lonely and haunting. Thomas reached the back of the ranch house without incident. Through the walls he could hear voices raised in argument. Something about dividing money. Honor among thieves was a fiction that rarely survived the introduction of actual currency. He positioned himself near the back door and waited. Minutes stretched into an hour. His legs cramped from the crouched position, but he did not move. Finally, the back door opened and a man stumbled out, fumbling with his belt. The man staggered toward an old outhouse, muttering to himself. Thomas let him pass, then slipped through the open door into the ranch house. The interior was as run-down as the exterior. Furniture lay broken in corners. The smell of unwashed bodies and stale alcohol permeated everything. Thomas moved through the darkness toward the main room where lamplight flickered. He could see the 4 remaining men now, seated around a table covered with cards and coins. Calhoun was easy to identify. He was the largest, with a thick beard and eyes that held no warmth. A gun belt hung from his chair within easy reach. Thomas stepped into the doorway, his rifle raised. The 4 men froze, their hands hovering over weapons they would never reach in time. Thomas spoke in a voice that carried the weight of absolute certainty. Calhoun was coming back to town to face justice. He could do it breathing, or he could do it draped over a saddle. The choice was entirely his. For a moment, nobody moved. The lamplight cast dancing shadows across faces twisted with calculation. Then Calhoun laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. He asked Thomas if he had any idea who he was threatening. Did this fool understand what happened to men who interfered in affairs that did not concern them? Thomas said he understood perfectly. He also understood that a young man had been murdered and someone needed to answer for it. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, steady as stone. The man who had gone outside chose that moment to return, crashing through the back door with his gun drawn. Thomas heard him coming and spun, but not fast enough. The shot went wide, punching through the wall behind him. Thomas returned fire, and the man went down with a cry. In that instant of distraction, Calhoun dove for his gun belt. What followed happened in the space between heartbeats. Thomas dropped to one knee as bullets tore through the air where he had been standing. His rifle barked twice. One of Calhoun's men fell back, clutching his shoulder. Another scrambled for cover behind the overturned table. Calhoun had his gun now, rising with murder in his eyes. Thomas knew he could not win this fight. Not here, not outnumbered. He fired once more to provide cover and then dove back through the doorway into the darkness. Bullets chased him, splintering wood and kicking up dust. He ran in a zigzag pattern, making himself a difficult target as he sprinted toward the ravine where Cassie waited. Behind him, men poured out of the ranch house, shouting orders and curses. Muzzle flashes lit up the night. A bullet tugged at his sleeve. Another whined past his ear. But Thomas kept running, his legs pumping, his lungs burning. He reached Cassie, grabbed the saddle horn, and swung himself up in one fluid motion born of decades in the saddle. The mare needed no encouragement. She bolted into the night, carrying him away from the chaos. They rode hard for 20 minutes before Thomas slowed to a walk and listened. No sounds of pursuit. Either the men were too drunk to organize an effective chase, or they had decided discretion was the wiser course. Thomas allowed himself a moment to catch his breath. His hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline. Blood seeped from a graze on his arm he had not even felt during the fight. He had failed. Calhoun was still free, and now he would be on guard. The element of surprise was gone. Thomas had maybe 24 hours before the Navajo deadline expired and war came to Redemption Ridge. He needed a new plan. As he rode back toward town under the vast expanse of stars, Thomas considered his options. They were limited and none of them particularly appealing, but giving up was not among them. He thought of Daniel again, of that unwavering sense of purpose his brother had possessed. Thomas might not have been born with that clarity, but he had learned to forge it through sheer stubborn will. He reached Redemption Ridge as dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost obscene in their beauty. The town was stirring, shopkeepers opening their doors, the blacksmith's hammer already ringing against his anvil, life continuing as though the world was not balanced on a knife's edge. Thomas dismounted outside the saloon and tied Cassie to the post. His body ached in a dozen places. The graze on his arm needed attention, but first he needed information. He pushed through the door to find Sullivan already behind the bar, preparing for the day. The bartender's face went pale when he saw Thomas walk in covered in dust and dried blood. Before Sullivan could speak, the door opened again behind Thomas. He turned, hand instinctively moving toward his gun. But it was not Calhoun. It was Aida. She stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the morning light, her eyes moving from Thomas to Sullivan and back again. When she spoke, her English was flawless, her voice carrying an authority that filled the room. She said she had heard what happened at the ranch house. Word traveled fast in this territory. She wanted to know why a stranger had risked his life attempting to bring her brother's killer to justice when the white man's law had abandoned them. What did Thomas Garrett hope to gain? Thomas met her gaze without flinching. He told her he was not looking to gain anything. He had seen too many good people die while others stood by and did nothing. If he could prevent one more death, one more family from experiencing the emptiness he carried, then the risk was worth taking. Aida studied him for a long moment. Her eyes were dark and piercing, seeming to look past the words to the truth beneath. Finally, she nodded slowly. She said her father wished to speak with him. If Thomas was willing, he should ride to the Navajo settlement before noon. She would guide him personally. Sullivan made a small sound of protest, but Aida silenced him with a single glance. She turned and walked out, clearly expecting Thomas to follow. He did, though every instinct screamed this could be a trap. Perhaps the Navajo had decided to take their justice from whatever target presented itself. Perhaps he was riding toward his own execution. But as he mounted Cassie and followed Aida's horse out of town, Thomas found he did not much care about the risk. His brother had died believing in something larger than himself. The least Thomas could do was show that faith had not been completely misplaced. They rode in silence for the first hour, following trails that wound through increasingly rugged terrain. The Navajo settlement was not visible from Redemption Ridge, hidden in a valley that offered protection and access to water. Aida led the way with practiced ease, her horse navigating rocks and narrow passages without hesitation. Eventually, she slowed and rode beside him. She asked where he had learned to shoot. Thomas told her his father had been a cavalry scout before settling down to farm. He had taught both his sons everything he knew about surviving in hostile territory. When the farm failed during a drought, Thomas had used those skills to make his way in the world. He had worked as a lawman, a guide, a bounty hunter. Whatever paid enough to keep moving. Aida asked why he kept moving. Thomas considered the question. He said he supposed he was looking for something, though he could not quite name what it was. A place where the things he had done mattered, where the violence and death added up to something more than just survival. She said that sounded lonely. Thomas agreed that it was. They rode on in silence after that, but it felt different somehow, less guarded. The Navajo settlement appeared as they crested a rise. It was larger than Thomas had expected. Easily 100 hogans and traditional dwellings spread across the valley floor. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played near a stream that cut through the center of the village. It looked peaceful, but Thomas could see the tension underneath. Men standing in clusters, weapons close at hand. Women watching the horizon. This was a community preparing for war. As they rode down into the valley, people emerged from their homes to watch. Thomas felt the weight of their stares, measuring him, judging whether he was threat or fool. Aida led him to the largest hogan situated at the center of the settlement. She dismounted and indicated Thomas should do the same. Inside, the air was thick with smoke from a central fire. Chief Tahoma sat on the far side, his weathered face impassive. He was older than Thomas had imagined, perhaps in his 60s, but his eyes were sharp and missed nothing. Two war chiefs flanked him, their expressions openly hostile. Around the perimeter of the hogan, other tribal leaders and elders watched with varying degrees of suspicion and curiosity. Aida spoke in Navajo, her words flowing like water over stone. Thomas did not understand the language, but he caught his name and sensed she was explaining what had happened at the ranch house. When she finished, Chief Tahoma studied Thomas for a long time before speaking. His English was heavily accented but clear. He said his son had been murdered for nothing, for the pride of a small man who could not accept being bested in a fair trade. The white man's law had failed them, as it always did when native blood was spilled. His people wanted war. They wanted to burn the town and everyone in it. But Tahoma was old enough to remember what happened when tribes went to war against settlers. The cavalry came. Women and children died. The survivors were marched to reservations where the land was barren and hope died slowly. He asked Thomas why he should trust that justice would be served. Why should he sacrifice his people's righteous anger on the word of a stranger? Thomas took a breath. He said he could not offer guarantees. He could not promise the outcome would satisfy everyone's definition of justice, but he could promise this. He would not stop until Calhoun faced consequences for his actions. Whether that meant bringing him to trial or ending the threat permanently, Thomas would see it through. Not because he expected gratitude or reward, but because some debts could only be paid in action. One of the war chiefs spat words in Navajo that Thomas did not need translated. The contempt was clear, but Chief Tahoma raised a hand for silence. He said that in 3 days, when he was a young warrior, he had been captured by rival tribe during a raid. He had been tied to a post and beaten, left to die as an example. But a stranger, a white trapper passing through, had cut him free in the night and given him his horse. The trapper had asked for nothing. He had simply done what he believed was right and then disappeared into the mountains. Tahoma had never forgotten. He had learned that character was not determined by the color of a man's skin, but by the choices he made when no one was watching. The chief stood slowly, his joints creaking with age. He walked to Thomas and placed both hands on his shoulders, looking into his eyes. He said he would give Thomas one more day. If by sunset tomorrow Calhoun had not been brought to justice, the war parties would ride at dawn the following morning. Nothing would stop them. But if Thomas succeeded, if he proved that honor still existed in this broken world, then perhaps there was hope for peace yet. Thomas nodded. It was more than he had any right to expect. He turned to leave, but Aida stepped forward. She spoke to her father in Navajo, her tone insistent. Tahoma listened, then a small smile crossed his weathered face. He replied briefly. Aida turned to Thomas and said she would be coming with him. Thomas started to protest, but she cut him off. She knew the territory better than any white man. She could track like a wolf and shoot as well as most warriors. More importantly, if Thomas succeeded in capturing Calhoun, having the chief's daughter present would prevent any claims of deception or foul play. Her presence would legitimize whatever happened. Thomas looked to Chief Tahoma, who simply nodded. This was decided. Thomas was gaining an ally whether he wanted one or not. They left the settlement within the hour. Aida rode a painted mare that moved with the grace of a deer, responsive to the slightest pressure from her rider. She had changed into clothing more suitable for tracking, leather pants and a shirt that allowed freedom of movement, a rifle secured to her saddle. As they climbed out of the valley, Thomas found himself reassessing his initial impressions. This was not some sheltered chief's daughter playing at being a warrior. Every movement she made spoke of competence earned through experience. The sun climbed higher as they rode, turning the landscape into a furnace. Heat shimmered off the red rocks, distorting distances and making mirages dance on the horizon. Aida led them on a route that skirted the main trail, using arroyos and rock formations for cover. She explained without prompting that Calhoun would have scouts watching the obvious approaches. Men like him did not survive by being careless. Thomas asked how she knew so much about the tactics of outlaws. Aida glanced at him, something almost like amusement flickering across her features. She said that her people had been dealing with violent men long before Calhoun arrived. Raiders, slavers, soldiers who saw native lives as worth less than horses. She had learned to think like predators because that was the only way to survive among them. Her father might be chief, but that title meant nothing if she could not protect herself and her people. They stopped at midday to rest the horses and drink from canteens that were already running low. The shade of an overhanging cliff provided minimal relief from the oppressive heat. Thomas watched Aida study the terrain with eyes that missed nothing, cataloging details he would have overlooked. The way the dust settled after the wind passed. The absence of bird calls in certain areas. Small signs that spoke volumes to those trained to read them. She caught him watching and asked what he was thinking. Thomas admitted he was reconsidering his assumption that she would slow him down. Aida said that men often made that mistake. They saw a woman and assumed weakness. By the time they realized their error, it was usually too late. Her brother had taught her that lesson. He had been the one person who never underestimated her capabilities. His death had torn a hole in her world that might never fully heal. Thomas understood that pain. He told her about Daniel, about arriving 2 days too late, about the promise he had made over a grave that would never be visited again. Aida listened without interrupting, her dark eyes reflecting something he had not expected to see. Understanding, not pity or sympathy, but genuine recognition of shared grief. She said that perhaps they were both trying to save people who could not be saved. Perhaps they were chasing ghosts across a desert that offered no redemption. Thomas considered this and said perhaps that was true. But the alternative was to do nothing, to let the darkness win by default. He would rather die fighting ghosts than live as one. Aida nodded slowly. She said her father had been right about him. Thomas asked what the chief had told her. She replied that Tahoma believed some men carried their honor like a wound never heal. Thomas Garrett was such a man. Whether that would save him or destroy him remained to be seen. They mounted up and continued riding as the afternoon wore on. The landscape grew more rugged, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses through narrow passages between towering rock walls. In some places, the path was barely wide enough for a single rider. Ancient petroglyphs marked the stone, symbols left by people who had walked this land centuries before white men arrived with their guns and their certainty. As evening approached, Aida raised a hand signaling them to stop. She dismounted and knelt beside the trail, examining tracks in the soft earth. Her fingers traced the impressions with delicate precision. 5 horses, moving fast, heading northwest. The tracks were fresh, maybe 2 hours old. Calhoun and his men were on the move. Thomas studied the direction they were heading and felt ice settle in his stomach. Northwest led to the Navajo settlement. Calhoun was not running. He was taking the fight to Chief Tahoma. Either he was insane or desperate enough that the distinction no longer mattered. Either way, they needed to move fast. They pushed the horses harder than was wise, racing against the dying light and the certainty that violence was coming. The sun dropped below the horizon, painting the world in shades of purple and gold that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Thomas's mind ran through scenarios, each worse than the last. If Calhoun reached the settlement before them, if he killed even one more person, the fragile peace would shatter beyond any hope of repair. Aida suddenly veered off the main path, guiding them up a steep incline that Thomas would have sworn was impassable. But the painted mare climbed with sure footing, and Cassie followed gamely behind. They crested the rise, and Aida pointed. In the distance, barely visible in the gathering darkness, 5 riders were moving through a narrow canyon. Calhoun's group, they were perhaps 20 minutes ahead, following a path that would bring them to the settlement's eastern approach. But Aida knew something they did not. There was a shorter route, a dangerous trail that dropped through a series of switchbacks down the cliff face. It would save them 10 minutes, maybe 15, enough to set up an ambush at the canyon mouth. The risk was enormous. One missed step in the darkness and both horse and rider would plummet hundreds of feet to the rocks below. Thomas looked at Aida and saw the same calculation playing out behind her eyes. She met his gaze and nodded once. They had no choice. The descent was a nightmare of loose stone and blind corners. Thomas gave Cassie her head, trusting the Mare's instincts over his own limited vision. Below them, he could hear rocks skittering down the cliff face, bouncing into the void. His heart hammered against his ribs, but he forced himself to breathe slowly, to remain calm. Panic killed faster than any bullet. They reached the bottom with minutes to spare. Aida positioned them behind a cluster of boulders that overlooked the canyon mouth. From here, they had clear sight lines on anyone emerging from the passage. The moon had risen, providing just enough light to see by. Thomas checked his rifle, confirmed every round was seated properly. Beside him, Aida did the same with economical movements that spoke of long practice. The sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls. Thomas felt time slow, each second stretching into eternity. This was the moment everything had been building toward. 5 armed men against 2 defenders in the darkness. The odds were terrible. But Thomas had learned long ago that odds were just numbers until someone started pulling triggers. Calhoun emerged first, his bulk unmistakable even in the shadows. The 4 men behind him spread out slightly, their hands resting on their weapons. They were relaxed, confident, unaware they were riding into a trap. Thomas sighted down his rifle barrel, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. 1 shot. That was all he would get before chaos erupted. He chose the man to Calhoun's left, the one who looked most alert. The rifle kicked against his shoulder and the man toppled from his saddle before the sound of the shot finished echoing. Aida fired a heartbeat later, and another rider went down. The remaining 3 scattered, diving for cover and returning fire blindly into the darkness. Bullets sparked off the rocks around Thomas and Aida. They ducked lower, repositioning after each shot to avoid giving away their exact location. Thomas fired twice more, rewarded by a cry of pain. That left Calhoun and 1 other man, both pinned down behind their horses. Then Calhoun did something Thomas did not anticipate. He slapped his horse, sending it running, and charged directly toward their position on foot, his gun blazing. It was suicide or brilliance. Thomas could not decide which, but it forced them to react rather than dictate the fight. Thomas stood to get a better angle and felt something punch into his side with the force of a mule kick. He staggered, his rifle clattering against stone. The world tilted sideways and he found himself on his back, staring at stars that seemed impossibly bright. Aida was screaming something, but the words were muffled, distant. Thomas tried to rise and discovered his body was not responding correctly. His side felt wet and hot. When he touched it, his hand came away dark in the moonlight. He had been shot. The realization was more surprising than painful. His brain was insisting this was important information, but having trouble explaining why. Through the haze, he saw Aida standing over him, her rifle tracking movement in the darkness. She fired once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. Calhoun's voice roared defiance, closer now, too close. Thomas fumbled for his pistol, his fingers clumsy and uncertain. He had to get up, had to help. But his body was refusing orders with stubborn insistence. Aida dropped her rifle and drew a knife in one fluid motion. Calhoun came around the boulder like a charging bear, his gun raised. What happened next occurred in fragments, snapshots that Thomas's fading consciousness struggled to piece together. Aida moving faster than seemed possible. The knife flashing in moonlight, Calhoun's gun firing into empty space, both figures crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs. Thomas forced his eyes to focus. Aida was on top of Calhoun, her knife pressed against his throat hard enough to draw blood. The outlaw had gone completely still, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with the sudden understanding that he was one heartbeat away from death. The last of his men was lying face down in the dirt 30 feet away, unmoving. Aida spoke in a voice so cold it could have frozen the desert air. She said that Calhoun was going to stand up slowly and drop his weapons. If he made any sudden movements, she would open his throat and leave him to bleed out under the stars like the dog he was. Calhoun nodded frantically, all his earlier bravado evaporating. Thomas managed to push himself into a sitting position, his hand pressed against the wound in his side. Blood seeped between his fingers, warm and insistent. The bullet had passed through, which was fortunate, but he was losing blood faster than was sustainable. He needed medical attention soon, or the question of justice would become academic. Aida relieved Calhoun of 2 pistols, a knife, and a smaller blade hidden in his boot. She bound his hands behind his back with practiced efficiency, using strips torn from the man's own shirt. Only then did she turn her attention to Thomas, kneeling beside him to examine the wound. Her hands moved with surprising gentleness, probing the entry and exit points. She said he was lucky. The bullet had missed anything vital. He would survive if they could stop the bleeding and prevent infection. She tore more cloth and packed the wounds, wrapping his torso tightly enough to make breathing an effort. Thomas gritted his teeth against the pain, refusing to make a sound. When she finished, Aida helped him to his feet. The world swayed dangerously, but he remained upright through sheer stubborn will. They had Calhoun. Now they needed to get him back to face justice before Thomas passed out from blood loss. The ride back was a blur of pain and determination. Thomas sagged in his saddle, trusting Cassie to follow Aida's horse. Calhoun rode between them, his hands bound, his earlier confidence replaced by sullen silence. Dawn was breaking by the time they reached Redemption Ridge, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that seemed to mock the violence of the previous hours. The town was already awake, people gathering in the street as word spread that someone was approaching. Thomas straightened in his saddle, refusing to show weakness despite the fire in his side and the exhaustion that made his bones feel like lead. Marshal Peters emerged from his office, his face going pale when he saw Calhoun bound and bloodied. The coward actually took a step backward, as though the prisoner might somehow break free and come for him. Aida dismounted and hauled Calhoun from his horse with enough force that the man stumbled and nearly fell. She announced to the gathered crowd that this was the murderer of her brother. He was being delivered to face white man's justice. If that justice failed, if this man was allowed to escape or was given anything less than what he deserved, her people would have their answer about whether peace was possible. The war parties were already assembled. They were simply waiting for one final reason to ride. Marshal Peters stammered something about proper procedure and waiting for a circuit judge. Aida cut him off with a look that could have melted stone. She said there had been enough waiting. Enough delays while guilty men went free and innocent blood cried out for justice. A trial would be held today. The people of this town would decide Calhoun's fate, and they would do it with her watching to ensure fairness. Thomas slid from his saddle, his legs nearly buckling. Sullivan and another man rushed forward to support him, half carrying him toward the saloon. Behind him, he could hear Aida organizing the trial with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Part of him wanted to stay, to see this through to the end, but his body had other ideas. Darkness crept in from the edges of his vision, and he surrendered to it without resistance. He woke in a bed that was not his own, in a room he did not recognize. Sunlight streamed through a window, suggesting hours had passed. His side throbbed with a deep, persistent ache, but the sharp agony had receded to something more manageable. Someone had cleaned and redressed the wound, wrapped fresh bandages around his torso. A glass of water sat on a table beside the bed. Thomas reached for it with a hand that shook slightly and drank deeply. The door opened and Aida entered, carrying a tray with food. She set it down and informed him without preamble that the trial had concluded. Calhoun had been found guilty by unanimous decision of the town council and a jury of 12 citizens. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out at sunset. Her father had been notified. The war parties were standing down. Peace, fragile and uncertain, had been preserved. Thomas absorbed this information, trying to feel satisfaction or relief. What he felt instead was a hollow emptiness. Justice had been served, but it would not bring back Aida's brother or his own. It would not erase the violence or heal the wounds, visible and invisible. It was simply the best outcome in a situation where every choice carried consequences. He asked how long he had been unconscious. Aida said it had been 6 hours. The doctor, such as he was, had examined Thomas and declared that with rest and clean dressings, he would recover fully. The bullet had done remarkably little damage considering how close it had come to ending him. She had insisted on tending him herself, not trusting the doctor's cleanliness standards. Thomas tried to sit up and immediately regretted the decision. Aida was beside him instantly, adjusting pillows and helping him into a position that did not feel like his insides were tearing apart. Her touch was efficient but not unkind. He thanked her, the words feeling inadequate for everything she had done. She waved away his gratitude. He had risked his life for people who were nothing to him. He had kept his word even when it would have been easier and safer to walk away. That kind of integrity was rare enough to be worthy of respect. Her people understood debts and obligations. This one would not be forgotten. The afternoon passed slowly. Aida brought him broth and bread, insisting he eat even when his stomach rebelled at the idea. She changed his bandages with careful hands, checking for signs of infection. They talked in the spaces between, sharing stories that felt more honest than anything Thomas had said to another person in years. She told him about growing up between two worlds, never quite belonging fully to either. He told her about the farm he and Daniel had tried to build before the drought killed everything they planted, along with their father's dream. As sunset approached, Aida helped Thomas dress in clean clothes someone had brought. He was determined to witness the hanging. He owed that much to the process, to the life that would be taken in the name of justice. They walked slowly to the town square, Thomas leaning on Aida more than he wanted to admit. A crowd had gathered, silent and somber. This was not entertainment. This was obligation. Calhoun was led from the jail, his hands bound, his face a mask of defiance trying hard to cover fear. The noose was already prepared, hanging from a sturdy beam that had been erected for this specific purpose. Marshal Peters read the charges and the sentence in a voice that barely carried to the back of the crowd. Thomas noticed Chief Tahoma standing at the edge of the gathering, flanked by 2 warriors. The chief's face revealed nothing, but his presence spoke volumes. The execution was conducted without ceremony or delay. One moment Calhoun was standing on the platform, the next the floor dropped away and the rope snapped taut. It was not instantaneous or clean. The body jerked and swung, taking long minutes to go still. Thomas watched without looking away, forcing himself to bear witness. This was the price of justice. This was what his promise had purchased. When it was finished, the crowd dispersed quietly. Chief Tahoma approached Thomas and Aida, his weathered face unreadable. He placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder and spoke in Navajo. Aida translated. Her father said that Thomas Garrett had proven himself a man of honor. He had kept his word at great personal cost. Such integrity deserved recognition and reward. The chief continued speaking, his words measured and formal. Aida's translation came slower now, her voice carrying a note Thomas could not quite identify. Tahoma was offering Thomas a place among the Navajo people. More than that, he was offering his daughter's hand in marriage. Aida was of marriageable age and had refused multiple suitors from their own tribe. She needed a man who understood strength and honor in equal measure, a man who would stand beside her rather than try to stand above her. Thomas had demonstrated those qualities. If he was willing, the union would bind their peoples together and create a foundation for lasting peace. Thomas felt the weight of every eye in the square turned toward him. His first instinct was to refuse, to explain that he was not worthy of such an honor, that he was a wanderer with no home and too much blood on his hands. But then he looked at Aida and saw something in her expression that stopped the words in his throat. She was not surprised by her father's offer. This was not some decision made without her knowledge or consent. Her dark eyes met his with calm certainty, waiting to see what he would choose. He realized in that moment that he had been running for years.
Running from his brother's death, from his own guilt,
from the possibility that he might deserve something more than an endless string of violent confrontations and lonely nights. Aida represented something he had thought lost to him forever. Not just companionship, but partnership. Not just acceptance, but challenge. She would never let him hide behind his wounds or use his past as an excuse for refusing to build a future. Thomas turned to Chief Tahoma and spoke carefully, aware that his words would carry consequences beyond this moment. He said he was honored beyond measure by the offer. He was not certain he deserved such trust or such a gift. But if Aida was willing, if she truly wanted this and was not simply accepting her father's wishes, then he would spend every day of his remaining life trying to prove worthy of her faith. Aida stepped forward and spoke directly to Thomas, not bothering with translation for the gathered crowd. She said she had watched him choose integrity over safety, justice over convenience. She had seen him face death without flinching and accept help without his pride turning it into weakness. These were qualities her people valued above all others. More importantly, these were qualities she valued. Her brother had been teaching her that strength without wisdom was just violence with better intentions. Thomas understood that distinction. That made him rare among men of any color. She said she would marry him if he would have her, not because her father commanded it, but because she chose it. The choice was hers to make, and she was making it freely. Thomas felt something shift inside him, like a door he had nailed shut years ago suddenly swinging open. He said yes. The word came out rough and uncertain, but he said it again with more conviction. Yes. Chief Tahoma smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his entire face. He announced to the gathered crowd that in 3 days' time there would be a wedding ceremony. All were invited to witness the union that would join Thomas Garrett to his daughter and bind their peoples together in peace. The Navajo and the citizens of Redemption Ridge would no longer stand apart as strangers. They would stand together as allies. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Thomas's wound healed faster than expected, his body responding to proper food and rest. Aida spent hours with him, teaching him the customs and traditions he would need to understand for the ceremony. She did not try to change him or mold him into something he was not. She simply helped him understand the world he was joining. The wedding was conducted at sunset in the valley where the Navajo settlement stood. Members of both communities attended, sitting together for the first time in memory. The ceremony blended traditions, honoring both cultures without diminishing either. Thomas wore clothing gifted by the tribe, decorated with patterns that told stories he was only beginning to understand. Aida wore a dress of white doeskin adorned with silver and turquoise, her hair braided with feathers and beads. Chief Tahoma conducted the ceremony, his voice carrying across the valley as he spoke of unity and strength, of two people choosing to walk the same path despite coming from different worlds. He spoke of his son, of the grief that had nearly consumed them all, and of how Thomas's actions had transformed that grief into hope. Sometimes justice required violence, but it should never begin there. It should begin with the courage to stand for what was right even when the cost was high. Thomas made his vows with a steady voice, promising to honor Aida, to protect her people as his own, to build rather than destroy. Aida made her vows with equal conviction, promising partnership and truth, strength and wisdom. When they clasped hands and the ceremony concluded, the gathered crowd erupted in celebration that lasted deep into the night. Later, much later, when the fires had burned low and most of the guests had departed, Thomas and Aida stood together looking at the stars scattered across the vast desert sky. She asked him if he regretted his choice, if the reality was meeting his expectations. Thomas considered the question seriously. He said he had spent years believing he did not deserve peace or happiness, that he was meant to wander until violence finally caught up with him. But standing here with her, watching their people celebrate together, he realized he had been wrong about what he deserved. Everyone deserved the chance to be more than their worst moments. Everyone deserved the opportunity to build something that lasted beyond their own life. Aida leaned against him, careful of his healing wound. She said that healing was not the absence of scars, but the willingness to let them be part of the story without letting them write the ending. Thomas had scars that would never fully fade. So did she. But together, they could create something neither could have built alone. Thomas wrapped his arm around her and felt something he had not experienced since before Daniel died. Not happiness exactly, but something close. Purpose. Belonging. The sense that his life was adding up to something more than just survival. He had come to this territory seeking work and maybe redemption. What he found instead was a reason to stop running. In the distance, a coyote called out to the night. Another answered from the opposite ridge. The desert was alive with voices, speaking in languages older than any human conflict. Thomas listened to them and understood that he had finally found what he had been searching for all along. Not a place, but a person who made staying worth more than leaving. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles and triumphs. But beneath them, two people who had chosen each other across every boundary that should have kept them apart stood together and looked toward a future they would build one day at a time. It would not be easy. There would be challenges and setbacks, moments of doubt and fear. But they would face them together with honor and courage, creating a legacy that would outlast them both. Thomas Garrett had ridden into Redemption Ridge with nothing but a worn saddle and a promise to himself. He was leaving with a partner, a purpose, and the beginning of something that felt remarkably like hope. The duel of honor had been won not through violence alone, but through the choice to stand for justice when walking away would have been easier. That choice had changed everything. It had saved a town, prevented a war, and given a wandering man a home. And in the end, that was worth every scar.